The fourth time I rewrote my will, I was sitting in my attorney's office on a Tuesday afternoon in October, and I remember thinking that I had become very efficient at this particular task. I knew which forms to ask for. I knew which sections needed updating. I knew how long it would take and how much it would cost and how to sign my name on the last page without my hand trembling, even when the rest of me was shaking. For times in 8 years. Each time, I had a reason. Each time, one of my children had told me something about the other that I could not ignore. Each time, I had believed them. I was 75 years old the last time I sat in that office. I was a retired nurse who had spent 32 years reading patients' charts, catching errors that other people missed, noticing the detail that changed everything. I had been trained, professionally and by temperament, to see what was actually in front of me rather than what I expected to find. And I had been manipulated for 8 straight years by 2 people I had raised from birth. I didn't see it until a stranger pointed it out to me. My name is Dorothy Harmon. I am 77 years old and I live in Seattle, Washington. For 32 years, I worked as a registered nurse, the last 18 of them as a charge nurse in the cardiac unit at a hospital in the city. I retired at 64 in good health, with a modest but comfortable life, a paid-off home in the Maple Leaf neighborhood, a retirement account, and 2 children I was enormously proud of. I am still in good health. I am still in my home. And I am telling this story because I spent 8 years believing I had a family problem when what I actually had was a con run by the 2 people I loved most in the world, who had been running it so long they may not have even realized anymore that it was a con. If you are new here, please subscribe and drop a comment telling me where you are watching from. I read every single one. Now let me tell you how this started. I raised Marcus and Celia alone. Their father, Raymond, left when Marcus was 9 and Celia was 6. He didn't leave dramatically. There was no shouting, no affair discovered, no single incident that broke the marriage. He simply became, over a period of about 3 years, a person who was present in our house, but absent from our lives, and one morning he told me he was moving to Portland to be closer to his brother, and he did. He paid child support reliably until both children were 18, and after that we had no real contact. He died of a stroke in 2019. I sent flowers to the service and did not attend. I say all of this because I think it matters. I raised 2 children by myself on a nurse's salary, and I did it without bitterness and without poverty, and I was proud of that. I worked nights when I had to. I worked doubles when the bills required it. I kept the house warm and the refrigerator full, and I was at every school play and every graduation and every moment that required a parent to be present. What I did not do, and I see this clearly now, with the advantage of distance, was give my children enough experience of conflict that they learned how to manage it as adults. When Marcus and Celia argued, I resolved it. When they competed, I smoothed it over. When one was upset with the other, I mediated. I told myself this was good parenting. What I was actually doing was preventing them from developing the tools to navigate difficulty with each other without me in the middle. I was, without understanding it, training them to route everything through me. Marcus is 3 years older than Celia. He became an engineer, structural, the kind who looks at bridges and buildings and sees the forces working against them. He settled in Seattle, which I was grateful for, and built a quiet, stable life with his wife Karen and their 2 children. He was reliable, precise, and somewhat emotionally remote, qualities that served him well professionally and made intimacy complicated. Celia moved to Portland after college and spent her 30s building a career in marketing. She was vivid where Marcus was contained, expressive, quick, the kind of person who filled a room. She married at 34, divorced at 41, and never remarried. She and Marcus had always had friction, but the friction was manageable when I was nearby. My husband, my second husband, Thomas, whom I married at 52 and loved with a gratitude I hadn't expected to feel again, died in January of 2015. Heart failure. He was 68. I had been his nurse before I was his wife, in the most literal possible sense. He was a patient in my unit for 5 days in 2001 following a mild cardiac event, and we met in that particular and unusual way that created, I always felt, a bond with no equivalent. Thomas's death undid me in ways I had not predicted. I had watched people die for 32 years. I had held the hands of strangers in their final hours. I had believed, in the private way that healthcare professionals sometimes believe things about themselves, that I was better prepared for loss than most people. I was not better prepared. I was just better at functioning while broken. It was in the year after Thomas died that things between my children began, quietly and then less quietly, to fall apart. The first conversation happened in April of 2016, 15 months after Thomas died. Marcus called on a Sunday evening. We spoke every week. He was consistent about that, regardless of what else was happening in his life. The call was ordinary until the last few minutes, when his voice shifted into a register I associated with him delivering professional assessments, careful, precise, slightly flattened. He said he had been hesitant to say anything, but he felt I should know. He said Celia had called Karen, his wife, 2 weeks earlier and had asked Karen, directly, what Thomas had left in his estate and whether any of it had gone to Marcus. He said Karen had been uncomfortable and had told Celia she didn't think it was an appropriate conversation to have without me present. Celia had pressed. Karen had ended the call. I listened to this, and I felt the particular chill of a fact that doesn't fit anywhere comfortable. I called Celia the next evening. She denied it, not defensively, but with a kind of weary exasperation, as if this were a pattern she recognized. She said Marcus had a habit of telling stories about her that cast her in a bad light, and that she had not called Karen about Thomas's estate. She said she had called Karen to ask about the grandchildren's birthdays because she wanted to send gifts, and that somewhere between that conversation and Marcus's retelling of it, the meaning had changed. She sounded completely believable. Marcus had also sounded completely believable. I did nothing with this. I filed it in the category of sibling friction and moved on. The second conversation happened 6 months later, in October of 2016. This time it was Celia who called me, and she was less careful than Marcus had been. She said she had driven up to Seattle the previous weekend. I hadn't known she was coming. She said she had wanted to surprise me, and that she had arrived at my house on Saturday afternoon and found Marcus's car in the driveway. She had rung the bell and gotten no answer. She had waited 20 minutes and then driven away. She said she had called Marcus afterward and asked if he had been at my house. He had said yes. She had asked what we had talked about. He had said nothing in particular, just a routine visit. She said, "Mom, he's over there all the time. I've driven by twice in the last month and his car was there. I just want to know, is he talking to you about the will? About Thomas's money? Because if he is, I want to be part of that conversation." I told her that Marcus visited me regularly, which was true, and that he and I spoke about many things, and that I found it strange she was driving past my house without stopping. That last part came out more sharply than I intended. She said, quietly, "I just don't want him to get there first." Get there first. I remember staring at the phone after she hung up. The phrase disturbed me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. Not because it revealed greed, though it did, somewhat, but because of the architecture it implied. The image of two people in a race, with me at the finish line. I called my attorney the following week and updated my will for the first time. Not dramatically, I added language specifying that both children would receive equal shares and that neither could contest without forfeiting their portion. It was a defensive move, not a punitive one. I told myself I was being practical. I told myself a lot of things that were not quite true during this period. The third warning came in the spring of 2017, and it was the one that should have made me stop and think, but didn't. I had a small cardiac event in March, not serious, a minor arrhythmia that required a brief hospitalization and a medication adjustment. I was in the hospital for 4 days. Both children came. They did not come at the same time. Marcus arrived on day 2, stayed through day 3, and left before Celia arrived on day 4. I found out later this was not coincidental. While Marcus was with me, he said something that lodged in my mind and refused to leave. He said he had spoken to my cardiologist in the hallway, which was true. I had given permission for both children to speak with my medical team, and the cardiologist had mentioned that my home environment was an important factor in recovery, and that stability and reduced stress were beneficial. Marcus said, "Mom, I've been thinking about this for a while. I think it would make sense for me and Karen to look into what it would take to have you closer to us. Maybe even on our property. There's the lot next door that came on the market last year. It would mean you're independent, but not alone." I said I wasn't ready to think about that. He said he understood and he didn't push. But 2 days later, before he left, he mentioned it again lightly, just a note that he had looked into it and the lot was still available. When Celia arrived on day 4, she had flowers and a bag of my favorite tea from a shop in Portland. She sat with me for 2 hours and we talked about nothing important, and it was exactly what I needed. Before she left, she said something that I now understand was not accidental. She said, "I heard Marcus was here. Did he try to convince you to move in next to them?" I said he had mentioned it. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Mom, I just want you to know, if you ever decide to sell the house, I would love to help you find something here in the city near me. No pressure. I just don't want you to feel like your only option is what Marcus is suggesting." I lay in that hospital bed and I felt, for the first time, the outline of something I couldn't quite name. Not suspicion, exactly. More like the sensation of standing in a room where the furniture has been rearranged slightly, everything familiar, but nothing quite where you expected it. I should have named it then. I didn't. The second will rewrite happened 6 months after I left the hospital. This time, Celia had told me in careful, measured language that Marcus had taken it upon himself to call my financial advisor and request information about my retirement account. The advisor, to his credit, had not provided anything, but he had called me to report the inquiry. I called Marcus. He said he had simply been checking on my overall financial picture so he could help me plan, and that he hadn't understood it was inappropriate. He sounded genuinely surprised by my concern. I rewrote the will. I added a provision that neither child could act as financial representative without written consent from both siblings and independent legal review. The third rewrite came in 2019, when Celia told me that Marcus had been telling his children, my grandchildren, that I had a favorite, and that the favorite was Celia, and that when I died, she would get more. I heard this from my own grandchild, a 12-year-old who asked me at Christmas dinner whether it was true that Aunt Celia was getting the house. I called Marcus that night, and I was not calm. He denied it. He said his daughter had misunderstood a conversation she had partially overheard. He said Celia had put the idea in his daughter's head during a phone call the previous month. He said he had proof, a text message Celia had sent to his daughter asking pointed questions about what Marcus said about the will. I asked him to send me the text. He sent it. It was there. Celia's number. Celia's words, asking a 12-year-old what her father had said about Grandma's house. I rewrote the will a third time, and I didn't speak to Celia for 6 weeks. She called me, eventually, weeping. She said the text had been taken out of context, that she had been asking because she was worried, not because she was scheming. She said Marcus had been poisoning the children against her for years. She said she felt like she was losing her family. I believed her. Or I believed enough of it that I let her back in. The fourth rewrite, in October of 2021, came after Marcus told me that Celia had met with an elder law attorney in Portland, not to help me, but to understand what legal avenues existed if a parent was believed to be making financial decisions under undue influence. He said this calmly, over coffee at my kitchen table, and the implication was unmistakable. Celia was preparing to challenge my mental competence. I felt something go cold in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. I rewrote the will again, this time including language that had been drafted specifically to withstand a competency challenge. My attorney, a woman named Patricia who had been patient with me through all 4 of these sessions, looked at me over her reading glasses when we were finished and said, "Dorothy, can I ask you something off the record?" I said she could. She said, "How much of what you know about your children's behavior comes from your children themselves?" I stared at her. She said, "I'm not suggesting anything specific. I'm just observing that in 8 years of working with you on these documents, every change has been triggered by something one of your children told you about the other one. I don't know what's true, but I think that's worth sitting with." I drove home from that meeting and I sat in my kitchen for a long time. The person who finally made me see it clearly was not my attorney, and it was not a friend, and it was not a therapist. It was a woman I had never met before and have only spoken to twice since. Her name was Renata. She was 73 years old, a retired schoolteacher, and she was sitting next to me in the waiting room of my cardiologist's office in February of 2022. We had been waiting for 45 minutes, the doctor was running behind, and we began talking the way people do when they are bored and slightly anxious, with small observations about the waiting room and the music and the coffee. Somehow, I don't remember exactly how it happened, I began telling her about my children. Not in detail, not with names, but in outline. I told her I had been struggling for years with a conflict between my son and my daughter, that I could never quite get to the bottom of it, that every time I thought I understood what had happened I discovered another layer. Renata listened without interrupting. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said something that landed in me like a key in a lock. She said, "When did you last speak to both of them at the same time? In the same room, or even on the same call?" I opened my mouth to answer and found that I couldn't. I thought back. Through 8 years of conversations, Marcus on Sundays, Celia on Thursdays, Marcus stopping by the house, Celia calling from Portland, messages and updates and warnings and evidence all flowing to me in separate streams, never converging. Never available for simultaneous examination. I said, "I'm not sure they've been in the same room since Thomas's funeral." Renata looked at me with the expression of someone who has just confirmed something they suspected. She said, "My sister did something similar to me. For 6 years, she managed my relationship with my mother by controlling what each of us knew about the other. It only stopped when my mother happened to mention to me something my sister had told her about me. Something that wasn't true. And when I told my mother it wasn't true, she realized she couldn't remember the last time she had heard anything about me from anyone except my sister. The person who controls the information controls the relationship," she said. "And the easiest person to control the information around is the one everyone is competing for." I thought about Marcus calling on Sundays, reliably, consistently, every week for years. I thought about Celia calling on Thursdays. I thought about how neither of them, in 8 years, had suggested a 3-way call, a joint visit, a family dinner. I thought about how every piece of evidence, every text message, every overheard conversation, every advisor who had received an unauthorized call, all of it had been reported to me by one sibling about the other, never witnessed, never verified independently, never seen by anyone except the person telling me about it. I thought about my attorney's question, "How much of what you know comes from your children themselves?" The answer, I now understood, was all of it. Every single thing. The nurse in me, the person who had spent 32 years catching errors, reading between the lines of a chart, noticing the detail that changed the diagnosis, had failed completely because she had been inside the situation instead of observing it from outside. I had not been a diagnostician. I had been a patient. I went home from the cardiologist's office, and I did not call Marcus on Sunday, and I did not call Celia on Thursday. Instead, I called Patricia, my attorney, and told her I needed to come in. Not to rewrite the will. Just to talk. Then I called Marcus and Celia, separately, on the same day, within an hour of each other, and I told each of them the same thing. I was hosting a dinner at my home on the last Saturday of March, and I expected both of them to attend. And I was not taking no for an answer. There was a pause in each call that told me everything about how unexpected this was. Marcus said he would check with Karen about the schedule. Celia said Portland was a long drive for a dinner. I said, "I have rewritten my will 4 times in 8 years. I have spent 8 years being told things about each of you by the other. I have never once verified any of it directly. That dinner is where I intend to start." The dinner was on March 26, 2022. Marcus and Karen drove down from their house. Celia drove up from Portland. I had made pot roast, which was the meal I had always made for occasions that required everyone to sit down and stay put. The first hour was painful. My children were polite to each other in the way that people are polite when they are performing politeness for an audience. Careful sentences, no eye contact held too long, questions about each other's lives that were technically interested, but actually armored. I let it go on for an hour. Then I set down my fork. I said, I want to tell you both something. And I want you to listen without speaking until I'm finished. I told them what I had come to understand. Not with anger, not with accusations. I had decided ahead of time that I could not afford anger, that anger would let them deflect into defending themselves instead of hearing me. I spoke the way I had learned to speak in 32 years of delivering difficult news to patients and families, clearly, directly, without softening what needed to be said, but without cruelty either. I said that for 8 years I had been receiving information about each of them from the other, and that I had acted on that information, changed my will, altered my decisions, adjusted my relationships, without ever verifying a single piece of it independently. I said I did not know how much of what I had been told was true and how much was fabricated and how much was distorted, and I said that at this point it almost didn't matter because the system itself, the system of each of them managing my perception of the other, was the problem regardless of the content. I said, I have one question for both of you, and I want you to answer it honestly, in front of each other. Has either of you, at any point in the last 8 years, told me something about the other that you knew was not entirely true? The silence at my dinner table lasted a very long time. Celia spoke first. She looked at her plate and she said, the text to Marcus's daughter. I was asking her what Marcus said because I wanted to know what to prepare for. Not because I was trying to involve her. Marcus looked at his wife, then back at me. He said, I did call your financial advisor. I told you I was just checking in, but that wasn't the whole truth. I wanted to know how much was in the account. I nodded. I waited. Celia said, I did call Karen about Thomas's estate. I said I was calling about the grandkids' birthdays because I thought it would sound better. Marcus said, I did tell my daughter that Celia was getting more. I was angry and I said it. I told her later it wasn't true, but I should never have said it. It went on for another 20 minutes. Not everything came out at that table, I don't think it ever does, in a single conversation, but enough came out that by the end of it, I had a clearer picture of 8 years than I had managed to build in all the time I had been living through them. The picture was not flattering to either of my children. It was also not simple. They were not villains. They were two people who had grown up routing everything through their mother, who had never learned to manage their anxiety about each other directly, who had spent 8 years feeding each other's worst fears in a loop that neither of them had ever stepped back far enough to examine. They had been playing me against each other, yes. They had also been playing themselves. In the weeks after the dinner, I did something I had not done in 8 years. I started verifying. I called my financial advisor and asked him directly whether Marcus had contacted him and what had been said, and whether any information had been provided. The advisor confirmed the contact and confirmed that no information had been shared. He also mentioned, carefully, that this was not the only inquiry he had received over the years. There had been 2 others, one from each sibling at different points. I called my cardiologist's office and asked to review the notes from my 2017 hospitalization. I wanted to know exactly what had been discussed with my children and whether the doctor had actually recommended I move closer to Marcus, as Marcus had implied. The doctor's notes reflected no such recommendation. What the doctor had said was that reduced stress was beneficial, a general comment that Marcus had built an entire narrative around. I reviewed the text message Marcus had sent me, the one Celia had allegedly sent his daughter. I showed it to a neighbor whose son works in technology and asked him to explain to me, plainly, what could and couldn't be determined from a screenshot. He explained that screenshots can be edited. He explained that it is not technically difficult to make a text appear to come from a number that it did not actually come from. I showed this information to Celia. I did not accuse her. I asked her, directly, whether she had sent that message. She said no. I believed her. More importantly, I now had a reason that was evidence-based rather than emotional to believe her. The screenshot was not independently verifiable. Marcus, when I asked him about it, was quiet for a long moment. Then he said he had received the screenshot from his daughter. He said he had not thought about whether it could have been altered. I said, Marcus, did you send it to yourself? He said, Mom. I said, I need you to answer that question. He said, I found it on her phone and I don't know where it came from. I thought it was real. I have sat with that answer for a long time. I cannot prove he sent it to himself. I cannot prove he didn't find it on his daughter's phone, perhaps sent by someone else, perhaps misidentified. What I know is that he took a piece of evidence he could not verify and used it to damage my relationship with my daughter in a moment when I was vulnerable. Whether he believed it or not, he made a choice. I called Patricia in May of 2022, and I rewrote my will for the fifth and final time. This time, the document did not reflect any of the dynamics my children had spent 8 years trying to create. The estate was divided equally. There were no provisions penalizing either child, not because they hadn't earned them, but because I had decided I was no longer going to let their behavior govern my legal decisions. The will was what I wanted it to be, based on my own values, not on the last piece of information either of them had given me. Patricia read through the new document and looked up at me with something that might have been relief. I also made 2 other changes that were not in the will. First, I hired a fiduciary advisor, an independent professional whose legal obligation is to my interests and no one else's, to oversee my financial affairs. Neither Marcus nor Celia has access to my accounts. Neither of them can make inquiries on my behalf without my written authorization and the fiduciary's co-signature. Second, I established a rule for myself that I follow without exception. I do not make any significant decision about my relationship with either child based on something I have heard only from the other one. If Marcus tells me something about Celia, I ask Celia directly. If Celia tells me something about Marcus, I ask Marcus directly. I do not adjudicate. I do not take sides. I listen and I verify and I wait. It is a simple rule. I should have made it 8 years earlier. My relationship with both children is different now. I would not describe it as better in the way that a healed bone is better, stronger at the break point than it was before. It is more honest, which is not the same as more comfortable. Marcus and I have had 2 genuinely difficult conversations in the past year about what happened and about his choices. He has not fully acknowledged everything. He may never fully acknowledge everything. I have made my peace with that in the way you make peace with weather. You cannot change it, only prepare for it. Celia came to Seattle for Christmas last year. It was the first Christmas we had all spent together in 7 years. It was not a movie-ending reunion. There was tension, and there was a moment after dinner when Marcus and Celia had a quiet exchange in the hallway that I chose not to overhear. But they sat at my table and they were civil to each other, and my grandchildren were present, and I made pot roast, and we were, in the most functional sense, a family. It is enough. For now, it is enough. I am 77 years old, and the thing I understand now that I did not understand for most of my adult life is that love does not protect you from manipulation. In fact, love is often what makes manipulation possible. The people who can hurt us most are the ones we are most unwilling to see clearly, because seeing them clearly requires us to look at the relationship without the softening effect of what we feel for them. I was a nurse for 32 years. I trusted clinical evidence. I documented everything. I never acted on a patient's self-report alone if I could verify it independently. I applied none of that discipline to my own family. And the result was 8 years of decisions made on information I had never questioned, about people I loved too much to doubt. If you take one thing from my story, let it be this: the person who controls the information controls the relationship. In a family, in a friendship, in any close bond, the person who manages what you know about someone else holds more power than you may realize. That power is not always used maliciously. Sometimes it is used by people who are frightened or competitive, or who have simply never been taught to handle conflict directly. But the effect on you is the same regardless of the intention. Verify what you are told. Ask direct questions. Create space where the people in your life can speak to each other, not just through you. And if you find yourself making decisions about people based entirely on what other people have told you about them, stop. Go to the source. Whatever you find there will be more useful than anything delivered at second hand. I am still in my house in the Maple Leaf neighborhood. The fiduciary advisor is excellent. Patricia is still my attorney, and she has told me, with what I detected as genuine relief, that she hopes we do not need to revisit the document for a very long time. Last month, Marcus called me on a Sunday, as he always does, and mentioned that Celia and he had spoken during the week. On the phone. Directly. about something unrelated to me. It was the first time in 8 years that had happened. I did not make a big thing of it. I said that was good to hear, and we moved on to other topics. But after I hung up, I sat in my kitchen in the afternoon quiet of a Seattle Sunday, and I felt something I had not felt in a very long time. I felt like I could stop watching. Tell me where you are watching from today, and if this story reminded you of something in your own life, I hope you'll share it. You don't have to use names. Just tell me what you recognized. I'll be reading. Thank you for being here.